topics to present this year, our board felt important to focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular human rights. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights specifically identifies education as a key human right. And the recent SDGs make a strong statement about equity in education. I looked on the UN site about these just today, and before COVID-19, it said inclusive and equitable quality education progress was way too slow. Over 200 million children will still be out of school by 2030. After COVID, school closures kept 90% of all students out of school for the year. This reversed years of progress in education. And people say, well, you know, we have remote learning. Meanwhile, remote learning remains out of reach for at least 500 million students. And another alarming factor is that only 65% of primary schools globally have basic hand washing facilities critical for COVID-19 prevention. So with this as a priority, I reached out to Dr. Heather Bennett, whom I've known for a few years, was privileged to participate in our equity task forces at the PA School Board Association. And I'm so grateful she agreed to speak with us tonight. We did share her bio on the flyer for tonight, but a few items to highlight are that she's Director of Equity Services at the Pennsylvania School Board Association. She travels the state meeting with educators, administrators, school board members, and legislators, passionate about providing the education all children need to succeed. She does, as they say, bleed blue and white, having gotten her undergraduate degree from Penn State, her law degree from Penn State Dickinson, and being an overachiever, she returned for her PhD in educational equity and administration. Additionally, she studied at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, and taught high school social studies in Fulton County, Georgia, with the Teach for America program. So as the chat just said, following the talk, we'll field those questions electronically, and we'll read those, get responses. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to have you joining us tonight, Dr. Bennett, and I'll turn this over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And it's real, I do bleed blue and white. So it's always great to come back home. So what I'm going to do now is going to share my screen. Okay. And I'm going to have to talk this out or I feel like I miss a step. Okay, great. So again, I'm really excited and I'm honored to be here today to have this conversation with you all as the speaker for the Center County United Nations Association Annual General Meeting. Again, I told you earlier, I'm a Penn Stater through and through. My mom went to Penn State. So it's always great to come back home. Even though we're doing this in this virtual setting, it's really great to be here nonetheless. So I really wanted to kind of start this conversation and talk by just acknowledging how wonderful the weather is. I hope that everyone had a chance to go outside and walk around and really enjoy the spring air. I think that we all deserved after the snow apocalypse of the last few weeks. And as you're looking around, I really like focusing on trees. When the weather starts to change. You start to notice that the barren branches become full of leaves and flowers. You start to hear the birds. You start to see the woodland creatures like squirrels and other animals that make their home on the tree. And as awesome as it is to focus in on what we're seeing in terms of the changes that are happening in terms of our natures, in terms of plants, I really want to center my talk, not focusing on what's going on above the ground, but actually what's going on below the ground, and really talk about the aspects of roots today. It is the roots that I feel like are the most interesting. The root stabilizes and anchors the plant in the tree. It absorbs water, it dissolves minerals, it stores food. There is a powerful, intricate network of processes that are happening below the ground, deep in the roots of the tree. And as you all know, I'm not a botanist by trade, I'm an educator. And so this is a really poor attempt to talk about botany, but I really wanted to kind of set the stage and just recognize that a lot of our practices in education change by like the leaves of the trees. We are always moving to some new framework or reform in education, and yet time after time, season after season, new administration after new administration, we do not see the change or see very little change in the existing achievement and opportunity gaps of our children in our country as well as around the world. So we have to understand that students still come into our schools, or in this case, the remote learning classroom on their computers, carrying the weight of poverty, of trauma, of systemic oppression, of such as racism, classism, ableism, and other forms, which are experienced inside and outside of the classroom. Furthermore, the COVID-19 pandemic and the systemic inequities that it has unearthed, specifically for marginalized students, as well as the subsequent clarion call for racial justice in the aftermath of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, has shown us very clearly that we need to really start thinking about and looking at the roots of our educational system, but not just in our educational system, in our systems and institutions as a whole. And so when I say roots, I'm really discussing the intricate network of processes that uphold and maintain the educational system, such as the policies, our laws, and procedures that have baked in narratives that centers monolingual, white, Christian, abled, middle class, hetero, cisgendered persons, and marginalize those who are not. And so again, I just really trying to focus on the roots of this work. And so as I move to a conversation about equitable and the just educational system for all, we have to really, again, really address the deep roots of inequity that have undergirded and reinforced our educational system. And so in today's talk, I want to discuss the origins of the roots of inequity that exist in our educational system. I want to talk about how such inequities are impacted under our current dual pandemics of COVID-19 and the call for racial justice, and how we can investigate, address, and hopefully uproot such inequities in our policies and procedures and plant a new tree that focuses on developing opportunities for students and families in our schools and districts across not only our state, but across the country. So this is what we're gonna plan on doing today. Let's see if we make it through. All right, so we'll start with the first one, history of inequity of education. And so before we start discussing the impetus of this topic, we have to define equity. You know, whenever I'm in front of, educators or board directors or stakeholders, I never assume that they know what this is. Even though I know there was a wonderful definition in the flyer for this, I'm always going to start off with a conversation about what equity is. And so, of course, I'm going to center PSBA's definition, which is the just and fair distribution of resources based upon each individual student's needs. Equitable resources include funding, programs, policies, initiatives, and supports that target each student's unique background and school context to guarantee that all students have equal access to a high quality education. I'm also going to read NSBA's definition, which is educational equity is the intentional allocation of resources, instruction, and opportunities according to need, requiring that discriminatory practices, prejudices, and beliefs be identified and eradicated. And finally, we're going to talk about PDE. We are in the state of Pennsylvania. A healthy and safe environment can help students thrive, and every student, regardless of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, should be provided the opportunity to learn free from discrimination, fear, or harassment. And so each of these definitions, I feel, are really important and elicit some characteristics of equity. First, it's important to understand that equity has to be fair. To practice equity, you have to see fairness, which is meaning that people and our students are given what they need to fully access and fully participate in the system. Two, it has to be inclusive, meaning that persons are provided a safe and healthy environment to be able to participate fully in the system. Inclusive means that their voices, their ideas, their cultures, their identities are embedded into the very framework of the system so they can feel safe, so they can feel healthy, so that they can feel they belong in the system as a whole. And also, it's important to address, it has to be just. meaning that we are remedying past and addressing present harms that have caused the inequities. And so it's important that we have to remind ourselves every day when we're thinking about systemic changes in this work, that we have to think about fairness, we have to think about justice, but we also have to think about inclusion as a whole as well. And so everyone has probably seen some version of this this picture. And what I'm really gonna wanna focus on today is this reality piece. Okay. And we have to understand that within our educational system, when it's not just, when it's not fair, when it's not inclusive, we recognize that our children are merely surviving, they are not thriving in these spaces. And so one major issue that I've noticed working with stakeholders is that school leaders have a hard time really understanding this reality piece. We focus a lot on the ideals of our educational system, or actually the perception of that we are a quality district and therefore we're doing a good job by everybody. It's important to recognize that the ideals doesn't necessarily match what we actually do in our educational system. At its heart, equity focuses on the reality that we have never really treated persons in this country equally, that through discriminatory policies, procedures, narratives, leading to inequitable resources, as well as a failure to acknowledge the unique identities, histories, cultures, and differences of our students and our families. Persons who have had immense privilege are superseding the fence, while we have students and families and persons who have been beaten down below the ground. And again, it's important to center this talk is discussing what is happening below the surface. As it pertains to education, not just in Pennsylvania, but of course across the country and across the world, we need to recognize that our students are receiving inequitable outcomes and access to a quality education based on a various number of factors: zip code, race, gender identity, family structure, and also class and the language and the intersection of all of those things that come into play. As we're addressing when we look at the research in regards to existing inequities, specifically as it pertains to the US, but I believe it pertains to other countries as well, is that for generations, our education and political and economic systems have provided less opportunities to low-income students, to students of color, to LGBTQ students, English learner students, students with disabilities, and students in resource poor and geographically isolated districts and schools. So in my trainings across Pennsylvania, I always say there's a juxtaposition between the ideals of who we are as a nation, which promotes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, versus what we actually do in this country and across the world, where we have promoted life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and equality for really just a few. And so I want to kind of just start this off. I feel like most persons in this room have probably seen Hamilton, whether in New York or Detroit or Chicago. I actually went to London to see Hamilton. And so in the musical Hamilton, Lin-Manuel Miranda reimagined our country's foundation, our founding mothers and fathers. And they were played by persons of color. So in the left, you have the wonderful Schuyler sisters, played by women of color. And so it's important to kind of think through that. That's this kind of construct of idealness, that we are a nation of so much diversity and inequality, and everyone has a shot. However, we have to understand historically that ideally our framers were majority white. Even though I wanted to center women in this conversation, we have to understand the ideals of who we are does not necessarily match what we actually are as a whole. And so it's important to recognize that the reality requires a deep dive and a deep look at the roots of our American justice system, of our American educational system. Systemic discrimination are the ways in which policies, procedures, and processes work to oppress groups of people and persons. We have to remember that the origin of this nation was not meant for all persons. we have to recognize that America has validated both socially, politically, economically, the viability of slavery for centuries. Indigenous persons and peoples lost their lives, their land, and their dignity, all on the basis of expansion. Immigrants were relegated to certain neighborhoods and opportunities, and their cultures and languages were denigrated as not American. Women were subsequently protected and kept from upward mobility, at the same time unprotected and subjected to abuse. And so even when we develop subsequent laws invalidating slavery and other forms of oppression, through continuous federal, state, and local laws and policies, still kept Black persons and persons who were not white, persons who were not Protestant, persons who were not affluent or cisgender or heterosexual, English speaking, and male from fully participating in the promise and the fullness of America. So I like to say this, we have to remember that women couldn't vote until 1920. Black persons and other persons of color couldn't exercise fully their right to vote due to discriminatory laws, Jim Crow laws, until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's important to recognize that persons of color, as well as those who of Jewish descent, could not have access to certain neighborhoods over others until 1968. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not get access to hotels, parks, and bathrooms. LGBTQ persons, interestingly enough, were not fully protected under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which focuses on employment discrimination, until 2020. In the landmark case of Bostock versus Clayton. So it's important to understand when we're thinking about systems, we have to talk about the roots. We have to talk about in terms of who has had access and who has not over time. So even when we have subsequent policies and laws like Bostock or Title VIII of the Fair Housing Act or the Voting Rights Act, these narratives that has created this oppression has been baked into the roots of this country that simultaneously systematizes privilege, at the same time continues to cause oppression. And so it's important that we recognize that this history of oppression and segregation continues, even if we propagate the narrative that America is fair, that it's just, it is equal. And thus persons who've been given the benefits are deserving of the American dream. And then we still continue to place blame on those who face barriers created by these systemic policies and procedures. So it's important that we're really navigating and really understanding the narratives and the histories of our policies and our procedures and practices that have existed since the foundation of this nation. And so I really wanted to kind of start that conversation out. And so thinking about the different ways in terms of systemic discrimination exists in our institutions, through housing, through redlining and blockbusting and segregated communities and racial steering, through the criminal justice system, through the over-policing and under-policing of poor and Black and brown neighborhoods, through criminal laws proportionally impacting persons of color, over-incarcerations of persons of color and persons with disability. Issues of police brutality continues to exist. We're talking about environment, spot zoning. I don't know if a lot of people understand what that is, but spot zoning is when there's a zoning policy in the middle of a poor or neighborhood of color where they create another use for it. So for an example, a landfill, or in the case of putting a highway in the middle of a Black or brown neighborhood, or other uses of it that diminishes the value of that specific community and neighborhood. Food deserts, not only in urban centers, but in rural spaces as well. Lead exposure, such as we saw in Flint, recognizing the existence of persons who have who are under the poverty line are more likely to have asthma than those who do not. In employment, we see a gender gap happen, a gender wage gap, race wage gap. We see in terms of economics, we see that there's a higher interest rate for borrowers of color, and also the extreme wealth gap that exists between races and groups of people. So it's important to think about the different ways these systems have been operating and the impacts that it has over time. And so as we can talk, we're talking about education today. So let's talk about education in terms of the way systemic discrimination impacts that. So I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but it's important for us to really reflect here that we have to understand that the roots of systemic discrimination in education is really deep. We have to recall that our schools are still very much segregated today. And thus invalidating this concept of integration that was placed in by Brown v. Board of Education. The remnants and the impacts of roots baked in systemic oppression continues today, as we can see the differences in terms of racial and economic segregation between school districts in Pennsylvania, but also across the country. It's important to think about school to prison pipeline, where students of color and students with disabilities are disproportionately given referrals for discipline. Researchers found that students of color are more likely to be disciplined for subjective means, while white students are more likely to get disciplinary referrals for objective means. So there's issues and conversations about bias and the fear and the stereotypes and stigmatization that Black boys are dangerous, as well as Black girls are disrespectful. And that's baked into our system as a whole. Then you have issues like digital equity, and which highlights the lack of digital tools and the access to digital tools and connectivity, as well as, training. And we see that in a lot of poor communities in the urban and rural spaces, but also in geographically isolated spaces as well. And so what this tells us is that there has been a lack of infrastructure and access in these communities. And that's also baked in systemic discrimination and oppression. And so it's important for us to think about the different ways, issues that are impacting our schools and our communities, and recognizing that this is baked in this long-standing history of systemic discrimination and oppression in our nation. So it's important that we recognize these are not isolated situations, that this is a process that has been developing over time, that has had an impact on the educational opportunities of students. And so this is a really, I feel, profound quote by Thomas 𝐄𝐝𝐿𝐮𝐢𝐭𝐲. And he writes here that public education has successfully shifted the blame for the failure of schools to meet the needs of marginalized students onto the shoulders of the clients they purport to serve. They have pulled off the perfect crime where they can never be held accountable, since the reason of failure in school is said to be the fault of poor homes, cultural handicaps, linguistic deficiencies, and deprived neighborhoods. The fact that schools are geared primarily to serve monolingual, white, middle class, and Anglo clients is never questioned. And so it's really important for us to really investigate, again, the roots of the issue, not just looking at the surface. And so let's talk about really talking about addressing these dual pandemics that we've been facing. Actually, to be honest, this is nothing new. This is actually a continuation of a lot of inequities that we have seen prior to what's happening in 2020. And so everyone should know in the next few days, I believe March 13th or the 14th for a lot of us, school was closed. So we're coming on to the year anniversary of that. And so it's important to frame the pandemic as an inequity accelerant. I believe Bob definitely did a great job of talking about it, especially a part of the UN sustainability goals of recognizing this is nothing new. COVID-19 leading to the closures of schools, districts, and other community spaces and businesses have merely exacerbated and exposed deep-rooted inequity gaps in our employment, economic, housing, healthcare, environmental, and specifically our educational system. And these gaps existed well before, of course, the pandemic, but unfortunately, we're going to see them widen over time, specifically as the pandemic continues. Also, if we decide to ignore equity. One of the major things that I saw, especially when the COVID-19 at the heart of it, the very beginning in the March, April, May area, because it was such a huge, had such a huge impact on disrupting the processes of school, the traditional elements of school, districts indicated, we don't have time to worry about equity, even though COVID-19 was the most important inequity issue of our time. And as you can see, these issues of racial assaults and discrimination against persons of Asian descent, that was happening before COVID-19, but exacerbated in the wake of COVID-19. And so we saw issues of xenophobia and racist fear that it just exacerbated. But again, the issues of discrimination existed well before March. You have digital inequity, access to connectivity devices and training. It's important to understand that districts were already moving towards a digital space prior to COVID-19. However, due to inequities in terms of access to resources, some schools were not ready for it, some districts were not ready for it, while others were. In terms of the spaces where some had the geographic infrastructure to have connectivity while other areas did not. And so this just exposed those gaps even more. Food and housing insecurity. For a lot of our students, our students needed food, was getting food from the schools. And so if schools are closed, how are they getting access to it? Thinking about housing insecurity, fear of being evicted was a huge element here. Trauma and mental health, how are we going to protect our kids that no longer can go to the school, but might be in that situation at home, but also recognizing the backdrop of COVID-19 and how that has created a lot of issues of mental health concerns for our students now, where they can't be with their friends. There's always this fear going on of whether their families or themselves will contract the virus. So this construct of trauma and mental health really exacerbated here. Healthcare access and the vulnerability of Black and Latinx and Native American populations who were disproportionately impacted, not just in terms of dying from the virus, but also now getting access to the vaccine. So these are these elements that are coming in, not only that our districts have had to navigate systematically and look at their systems, looking at their systems of how we treat others, looking at their systems of curriculum, look at their systems of digital equity, look at their systems of professional development, look at their existing policies. Now that they had to do a lot of stuff online and not in person, had to have navigated this through this time. So again, this was a system-wide space. And then of course, thinking about and addressing racial injustice. I like to say here, is that after the deaths of George Floyd and the continuous killing and harming of Black men and Black women, it's important that we recognize that what happened over the summer was not a new occurrence. And that we had that systemic protests erupted, leading to really interesting, serious conversations and proposed actions to really tackling not only policing, but also thinking about how we view our own educational system and how our students feel like they belong in their educational system. And so I wanted to start this conversation off real quick with like, I can't breathe, and recognizing that there's a lot of trauma involved with experiencing and seeing racism over and over and over and over again. For a lot of persons of color, families of color, as well as teachers and staff of color and board directors of color, seeing another Black body die on screen over and over and over again is traumatic. And so we really needed to really think about the different ways in which that's happening, not only in our screens, but also the experiences of racism, of classism, of ableism, of genderism, and the intersection that exists in for students and families in our of marginalized backgrounds in our districts. And another thing that we saw too was that districts started to center student and families and staffs of color in this space as well, that they were typically ignored. But when this came out, it seemed like, oh, wow, I did not know that this was happening. And so we saw this shift and change in terms of how districts were thinking about who we needed to center, who we needed to value in this conversation. And that led, of course, to an examination of embedded systemic oppressions and anti-Blackness in our institutions and spaces. So, and also this led to accountability. How do we hold accountable to students, to teachers, to administrators, to even board directors who may be moving, who are saying or issuing discriminatory comments in spaces? So how do we educate? How do we, through professional development, but how do we hold accountable these spaces? So these are all the major issues that were coming up out of this moment. And so I wanted to say, as we move forward about the work of moving towards thinking about the deep-rooted issues of what these two events came out of is important to think about. It's so important to understand that this is a system-wide issue, that we can't just develop practices, that we have to really examine the different ways our systems have broken down, as well as has maintained the status quo that has led to the gaps that we're seeing right now and having to deal with the crises that we are dealing with in our districts. And so let's talk about, I'm gonna tie a nice little bow on it. We're gonna talk about something positive about how we can develop systems of opportunity here. And I really wanted to start off with this quote by Isabel Wilkerson, phenomenal book, Caste. And she writes in the second chapter that America is an old house. We can never declare the work over. Wind, flood, drought, and human upheavals batter a structure that is already fighting whatever flaws were left unintended in the original foundation. When you live in an old house, you may not want to go into the basement after a storm to see what the rains have wrought. Choose not to look, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you are ignoring will never go away. Whatever is lurking will fester, whether you choose to look or not. And so I want to kind of center this last conversation about and about how we need to kind of look at the foundation. That the issues are already there. It's already in the basement. We know it's a mess, but we choose not to go there. We choose not to see it because we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to clean it up because it's really overwhelming. But here's the thing, our kids deserve it. Our communities deserve us to look and see what our narratives are, what our policies are that has caused harm in order to address it. And so we're gonna now move into how and ways in which we can think about addressing these roots, addressing the foundation to create opportunities for our students and our families. And so in order to us to think that, we have to think about how we think about equity in terms of not just the characteristics of equity, but also what equity needs to do here. Equity is a pedagogical shift of how we traditionally have done education. We have typically centered for a long time the experts, the structure of the educational system. We tell families and parents how to engage with us. We've also centered families and communities who have had privilege, who has the social capital to engage with us in the way we want to engage with us because they've gotten a privilege out of it. So equity is saying, no, we need to really re-examine and turn that on its head and centering those that have experienced marginalization by the system. Because what we know is this, if you get to those who've experienced marginalization, you get to everybody. When you center those who've experienced privilege, you don't get to everybody. So it's important for us to think about it that way. And so this is coming out of the Equity Literacy Institute. And they say, in terms of thinking about equity as a framework, it is a commitment to deepening individual and institutional understandings of how equity and inequity operate in organizations and societies. Again, roots. The individual and institutional knowledge, skills, and will to vigilantly identify inequities, eliminate inequities, and actively cultivating equity. So again, it's getting into the concept of what we need to do. What is the frameworks that need to happen in order for us to really dig deep into terms of the understanding and unearthing the root causes of a lot of the issues that we're having in our districts, and then of course, eliminate them and address them. So this is part of PSBA's equity system continuum, and this is our equity as a foundation image. And so it's important to recognize how we need to think about equity. Equity is not a topic, it is not a recommendation. It has to live and stand as the foundation that lifts up every aspect of the educational system. It has to lift up school boards, it has to lift up administration, teachers and staff, families and communities, HR, who we're hiring, budgets, how are we dealing with the money? Where does it go and who does it go to? Partnerships, who are we partnering with? Curriculum, is it culturally responsive? Academic supports, are we meeting the needs of our students? Technology, transportation, how are kids getting to school? Food services, are we making sure the food is kosher and meeting the needs of our different and diverse students and what they require? All of this lifts up to students, to the end of making sure that students are given what they need to fully access their educational experience. And so again, equity has to live and stand as the foundation. So to close it all out, I want to kind of address some 6 major points to kind of support this work, and to think things that we need to do to build a new foundation to unearth the roots in our districts. We have to first examine the existing roots, the foundation of your education entity. We have to look. So going back to the 𝐈𝐬𝐬𝐿 quote, we can't just ignore the base, and we got to go down there. We got to look at what's going on. You have to investigate your policies and laws and procedures that built up your district. That is taking an equity lens at that, but also investigating the narrative behind those policies, behind those laws, behind those procedures. We have to look at our history of segregation and oppression in our districts and recognize that it exists, right? And so we have to decenter the propagation of whiteness, affluence, and heteronormative constructs in your investigation as well. It's important to talk with your alumni about their experiences, specifically those who are from marginalized backgrounds. We have to they will tell us what their experience was in that district. We have to acknowledge that there is a history or current space of hurt and harm in order for there to be reconciliation and trust with the district. So it's important to make sure that we're acknowledging those things and not dismissing it. And here's another piece that I really wanted to kind of iterate, like, districts do not necessarily do this introspective work unless something happens, unless they have to, unless there's a lawsuit, or unless there's media attention attached to it. We have to be proactive with this. And so it's important for us to think through that. Second, we have to focus on the data. We have to explore the data to assess the impact of systemic oppression. And that's really just looking at the ways through qualitative and quantitative data, and making sure that we are really addressing and thinking about the barriers through looking at our opportunity engagement gaps in our district, and recognizing that not all of our kids are doing well. So we have to make sure we're looking at the data. I would also say conduct an equity audit. It's really helpful in this space. Number 3, we got to center include the voices of students and families, specifically those who have been marginalized. And so again, we got to look below the surface. Our kids are made up of more than one identity. So it's important to recognize the multiplicity of identities and characteristics of our kids, and making sure that we're addressing that, them as a full person and not just that one identity. We have to make sure we are asking our families that are experiencing the marginalization as a part of task force teams, that they're a part of committee structures, that for parents who have asked problems with connectivity, why aren't they a part of any of the solutions for the digital equity work in the district? Instead, so it's important for us to center those voices. 4, we got to continuously educate key stakeholders on what equity is, why it is important, and how to practice it. It's important to recognize that not everyone knows this work. And so you have the professional development is important with your staff, with your administration, with your board, but you also have to reach, of course, students and community members. How are you continuously educating people on what this is, why it's important, and how to move it forward? And then once you have that, you have to develop a campaign for it. It can't just live on your website, or it can't live in that, it's a goal for Equity Day in February. It has to be systematically embedded in every aspect of the educational system. And that includes utilizing your media in an effective way. Working with your community and municipalities to creating a campaign for equity is not just living in the district as the education space, but also throughout the entire system as a whole. And number 6, you have to remove harmful systems, embed equity into existing systems, and create new systems. And that really is making sure, as we're doing that data work, as you're examining the roots, that you get rid of the things that are harmful to students. And instead, you're embedding anti-racism, you're embedding culturally responsive practices into your existing policies, at the same time developing new policies to meet the specific needs of your students, because you've already asked the needs in earlier timeframes. So it's important to think about these 6 steps in terms of moving towards an educational equity space and developing a new foundation. I will say this about policy. Policy is great, but implementation matters as well. So it's important to recognize that you're always reevaluating your processes, your policies, your procedures through an equity lens, meaning this: you are looking at the data, you are making sure that you're acknowledging disparity gaps, you are making sure, figuring out why those disparities exist. You're asking people who this decision impacts, specifically families and students that it's impacting, in order for you to create new policies and practices that are going to make sure that you're dealing with the barriers that existed within that original decision. So it's a constant process. So just know that you're never going to be done. It's always a constant process, but thinking about it through this lens might be really supportive and helpful to creating new systems. So I'm going to end it here. I really, again, I love trees. So I love always ending it with a good picture with the tree here. So we have to do more than focusing on the leaves. We got to do more than focusing on the branches. We got to do more than focusing on the cute little woodland creatures that are going to be coming out in the middle of spring. Because they only tell, when you look at the surface of a tree, you're only telling what's going on. You don't tell, it's not really indicating why it stands, why the inner working intricacies of this space, of this plant, of this system. And so it's important that we're investigating the roots and not being afraid to investigate the roots in order for us to really make a transformation in our schools, in our districts. So that's my talk. I don't know how to end things well, so I'm just gonna stop talking.
All right, we had a couple questions submitted. I've asked Matt to get tuned up and read them to you. I will say, you know, that was really, really insightful. And it's, you know, haven't been on the school board for 20 years. You know, these things come up and it's just so sad when you hear these stories. I mean, her daughter taught high school in the Bronx, and she had rats in her classroom and ceilings falling in. And, you know, I grew up on Long Island. What happened in my high school, you know, out there, that was a brand spanking new high school. And, you know, so you can say the funding is equitable, you know, it's, yeah, right. But, you know, the inequities go beyond a dollar amount. So I really appreciate what you said. And so I asked Matt, you get those questions? Can you fire them off to Dr. Bennett?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome. All right. And again, if you have any questions for Dr. Bennett, you can put them either in that QA box at the bottom of your Zoom screens, or you can put them in the chat and we can read them from there. So Dr. Bennett, the first question we have for you is from Morgan. Morgan asks, what if you are not a policymaker or upper level administrator that can make these large scale changes? How can you make others see this work matters on all levels?
So when I talk about systems, I'm primarily talking about the education system, but the educational system includes, of course, stakeholders, includes community members, includes parents, includes business persons, right? And so it's important to think about participating in the school space, even if you don't have a student in the school. If there's an equity task force team, there's an opportunity for you to join that opportunity. Also, it's important to keep learning and growing in this work, making sure you're reading and you're learning and you're moving and talking with your neighbors and participating in events in the municipality. You play a big role as a community member in this systemic work, because it's just not isolated also in the school. It's not just isolated among the people at the top. It's actually a whole organism that's at play here, where of course the administration and the board has a lot of roles here, but your staff does, your students have, their families, their neighbors, everybody plays a role. And so in terms of advice, in terms of supporting this work forward, of course, educate yourself, participate in professional development in your own organizations, but also in the municipality, in the school, if there's an opportunity. And then, of course, making sure that you are engaged in district-wide work as well, and moving this equity work forward. So that's my advice in terms of that system-wide work.
Awesome. Thanks. Let's see. I'll try to get ones that are related. Andy asks, how do you have these conversations in communities that may have fear of pushback?
I always say expect the pushback, but it's also, I think one of the things that we have to get across is this. And this might be something that's my optimism here. I really do believe deeply that people want the best for our kids. But I also understand deeply that we're all coming in with very different experiences, which impacts our lens, which of course impacts the way we see others and how we experience the world. A lot of people have no idea because they never had to experience what racism is. They may never have known what classism is or genderism is. Again, we're all walking in with our own privilege and also experiences of oppression at the same time. And so people are coming in with that. So I always tell people all the time, it's important to practice what you believe, say what you believe, but also understand that people may not be where you're at, and that's okay. You don't have to dismiss their experience, but you can hold them accountable, calling them in as you're calling them out. But at the same time, just know that you can't be afraid of pushback. We have to understand, for a long time, a lot of our kids are hurting. Our kids are being harmed by a system because we are ignoring their issues and their needs. So we cannot be afraid of speaking truth to power. But my advice always is centering the voices of your students and families is so important here, especially those who've experienced marginalization, but also looking at your data too, and what the data is showing. Data will show you exactly how people are experiencing that too. And that helps to kind of negate some of the pushback that might be happening at the district level or the school level. So I say, data, voices, collecting that data, centering those voices, and also making sure that you are coming at a person with respect, but also understand that the space that we exist in is no joke, that we have to make sure that we are creating a safe environment for our students, and they cannot be ignored either. So we cannot be afraid to push back.
Thank you. And since you said about data, Denise says, can you elaborate on the data that needs to be utilized and how to give credence to that data when there is so much distrust these days?
Well, like anything in data, of course, it can be subjected to so much. I mean, it can be subjective, I guess, in terms of what you're choosing for the data, but also the interpretation of it as well. When I talk about data, I'm talking about two things. First, let's talk about qualitative. Qualitative, we don't do that well, I don't think, in our districts and communities in terms of collecting qualitative data. And that's the stories of our students and families. And again, collecting that data through surveys as well. Stories are important. Stories tell you why the situation happened. What is, of course, the numerical stuff. So you can talk about the achievement opportunity gap. And those numbers actually are not just found, of course, in the district. They are also found in the U.S. Department of Education has the civil rights data collection has data as well. And so it's important to think about it that way in terms of looking at disciplinary rates, looking at engagement, looking at, I don't like to say focusing on achievement gaps, because achievement gaps are caused by opportunity gaps. So really focusing on access to AP, focusing on tracking, focusing on who has access to gifted programs, extracurricular activities. There's a number of ways to look at, investigate opportunity gaps that the district itself can collect, but also they give that number to, of course, the PD and of course the US government as well. And so in terms of trust is built when there's transparency. That's my theory. And so it's important, of course, you're not going to show everything, but it's important also to be aware and saying, like, how can we show people, where our gaps are? I think unearthing roots for districts is actually a healthy process. You might not want to unearth everything because there's a lot of maybe legal implications into that. But I would always say it's important. This is why we have to do this equity work. Your data is going to tell you why and what priorities you're going to have to focus in on as a district. And so, I think data is extremely important. And if you have a history and a culture of transparency in the district, I think you can kind of negate some of the distrust that might be happening, especially when it comes to data. But again, I might just be very optimistic here.
Thank you. In terms of transparency, Brian asks, if the first step is to examine our basement of our old house, what exactly do we use to shine a light on the items that matter most?
Ooh, thank you so much for using that analogy. That was great. I think one of the highlights again is to since I went to Penn State, I'll just use my dissertation as an example. One of the things I did was I looked at how housing and school policy function together to contribute to the racial and economic segregation between school districts. And so what I looked at a lot is the history. I looked at newspaper clippings. I looked at policy shifts and changes over time. I looked at demographic shifts that have changed over time. I looked at school board minutes. Now, I'm not saying I was doing this for a dissertation, but I think it's important to really think about and talk to alumni. They can shed a light about their experiences in the district, but also look at how policies have shifted over time. Look at when there was a moment of historical segregation or historical racial unrest or historical LGBTQ discrimination or anti-Semitism. Like it's important for us to say that exists. A lot of districts don't want to just say it out loud. It's important for us to say that this stuff exists, and this is why we have to develop systemic ways to make sure that our kids, whoever they are, feel safe and loved, because that narrative of ignoring it is not the same narrative of those who are experiencing marginalization. They see it all the time. They see that. And so it's important that we acknowledge their experience as well and the history of experiences of students in your district. And so I think shedding a light in terms of where we shed lights in, I think it's important just looking at the history of things, and that you can find that, but also, of course, now examining existing policies over time, practices and procedures, and having a conversation with your district as well as maybe even community about the impacts of those policies and procedures on your students and also in the community as well.
Can we get one more, Matt, before the top of the hour, and we can let Heather take a break?
I think we can. We'll keep the basement metaphors rolling. Norma asks, since you work with PA school boards and you do research, do you present specific recommendations to school districts? Have you looked in the basement? Do you have localized data to present school boards? And are there methods to teach others how to look in the basement?
So the one thing about PSBA, we've developed a lot of frameworks, and one of the frameworks that we have in place, we have an equity lens approach to looking at policies and practices with an equity lens to support the work. We have a toolkit in terms of helping, like, action steps to kind of think about it from a system-wide space, like what are steps to do this work in an effective way? How do we do this? What are the questions that you should ask? We have a policy guide, an equity policy template to support the development of new educational equity policies, as well as a policy lens approach of looking at existing policies with an equity lens. And so we really are trying to help districts, and we have, of course, workshops and trainings, about 5 different trainings focused primarily on working primarily with districts and really understanding their local context to have those big conversations about the basement, to talk about what are the issues, what are the roots of the systemic work that you exist in, especially with boards, because you are really thinking, you're not in the weeds, you're not in the day-to-day action of school life. You are legit talking about the governance space and your budgets, your policies, curriculum, you're talking about communication, your engagement with the community, and you set the board goals and the vision for the district. And so it's so important to understand that basement, what are those major systemic issues in order for you to develop and help promote policies and practices and procedures and processes that would invalidate and eliminate institutional barriers in your district. So we have a number of resources at PSBA to support that work for school boards.
Okay, I see Trang was asking about Carol's question. Was Matt, do you have it? It was
yeah,
about
Carol
was asking, does data really represent everyone involved?
And I'm going to be honest, it doesn't. I don't think we don't collect enough data, and there's some reasons why we don't collect some data. So for an example, LGBTQ persons, we don't technically collect that data for a lot of different reasons. One major reason is maybe we just don't know, but also the fact that we have to be careful in the sense of making sure that we're not outing any students or our students are being harmed in our collection of data. So it's really but that's why I think it's so important for qualitative data. We might not have the quantitative numbers, but it's important to making sure that we are listening and centering stories of those experiencing marginalization in our schools so that we at least hear from. And just understanding this, every student is different. Every student's experience is different, even if there's a collective understanding of a certain circumstance or situation. So it's really important that we collect stories as much as possible, that we, of course, collect the data that we can collect, and of course, utilize that data, qualitative as well as quantitative data, to develop priorities for the district moving forward. Just to be honest, this work is hard. It is hard work. We're talking about systemic shifts and changes. I said earlier, it's a paradigm shift of how we traditionally done education. That takes a lot of time and effort. It takes an internal and an external work being done at the same time. However, you have to start somewhere and you have to start at the data. And so, and because that will help you prioritize and it will also help organize the work in an effective way. But again, we cannot ignore stories. We cannot ignore the qualitative piece. We can't just focus on the quant.
Well, thank you. Got a lot to digest, and we really appreciate, you're giving us time tonight. We're hoping to send a follow-up survey email that people attended just to get some feedback and also, let us know how we can improve on it. I don't think we can improve on your presentation. That's terrific. I'll let you know, and thank you for giving us your time tonight. We are going to make a purchase of some UNICEF educational supplies to be sent globally in your name.
That's wonderful.
That's the way of
Thank
saying
you.
it. So, rather than an honorarium or something like that, I think that's an important thing to do. So, so again, thank you very much. So thank everyone for joining us tonight.